Hi, I know I'm just a cat, but I believe in kindness. If you click subscribe under this video, you'll make my day.
I don't know if there's a specific moment when you realize your own family doesn't actually know you, or if it's more like a slow drip of silences, of dinners where your voice goes unheard, of phone calls where no one asks how you really are. Maybe it was always there, in the way my mother smiled just a little wider at my sister's report cards, or in the way my dad only ever brought up Rachel when bragging at barbecues, never once mentioning that I existed outside the phrase, our other daughter. Maybe it became clearest when I left, and no one followed. They always said Rachel was the smart one, the kind one, the one with promise. When we were kids, she was the girl who made the honor roll, played piano for the church recitals, won the 4-H ribbons at the fair. I was the one who liked being alone, who fixed broken radios in the garage, who asked questions nobody wanted to answer, like why Dad always locked himself in the den after dinner, or why Mom cried when she thought we were asleep. They called Rachel their sunshine. I guess that made me the shadow. By the time I was 19, I'd had enough of their little suburban circus. I packed a duffel bag, caught a Greyhound at 4 in the morning, and left without saying goodbye. Not because I hated them exactly. More like I realized that staying meant dying slowly, suffocating under the weight of always being less. I didn't tell them where I was going. And you know what? They didn't call, not once. I enlisted. Basic training was hell, but it was the first time someone actually looked me in the eye and said, "You can do this." I wasn't anyone's sister. I wasn't someone's disappointment. I was Emily Carson, and I knew how to shut up and get the damn job done. From Fort Bragg to Kabul, from embassy lockdowns to debriefings in cold concrete rooms with one flickering light bulb, I built a career on being invisible. That was the funny part. I became really damn good at being the person nobody noticed until it was already over. You wouldn't know me if you passed me on the street. And that's exactly how I liked it. For over a decade, I lived a life my parents wouldn't understand if I wrote it out in crayons. I moved through layers of government contracts, security clearance upgrades, and operations that never made the news. You know those grainy photos they flash on TV when something major happens, with agents in the background whose faces are blurred? That was me, always one row behind the podium, ears on every word, hands ready if things went sideways. I've stood next to men who could order missile strikes before breakfast. I've read things that made me wish I'd never learned to read. But none of that mattered to my family because they never asked. They assumed, like always, that I was still drifting, still figuring it out, still not quite good enough. Meanwhile, Rachel, sweet, polished, suburban Rachel, was the queen of their little kingdom. She married some guy named Brent, who sold insurance, popped out 2 kids with matching lunchboxes, and hosted gender reveal parties where everything was beige and tasteful and utterly dead inside. And every holiday, every call I didn't make, I knew I'd become more myth than person to them. The lost daughter, the weird one, probably working retail or bartending or finding herself. Then about a month ago, I got a voicemail. It was Rachel. Her voice hadn't changed at all. Still cheerful, still too loud, still pretending everything was fine. She said Mom wanted to do a real family dinner, just once, and they thought maybe I could come down, just dinner, just for old time's sake. Her tone was casual, but I could hear the strain under it, like she was trying to act like it didn't matter whether I said yes or not. At first, I almost deleted the message. I mean, why the hell would I? Why show up just to be ignored again, to be the outsider at a table that never really had a seat for me? But something about her voice stuck in my brain. And maybe I was feeling reckless, or maybe I was tired of being invisible, even if only for one night. So I replied, one word, fine. The Sunday before last, I flew down. I didn't tell them I'd be getting in early. I didn't tell them I'd be staying at a hotel instead of crashing in my childhood room, which I'm pretty sure had been turned into a craft storage closet anyway. I rented a car, took the long way through town, passed by the old grocery store that used to have a gumball machine out front, and sat in the church parking lot for almost 20 minutes, just staring at the stained glass window where Rachel used to sing Amazing Grace every Easter. And then I pulled into the driveway, same house, same chipped porch swing, same wind chime that always clanged too loud in the breeze. I knocked once, and before I could even lower my hand, Rachel opened the door. She looked exactly like a Facebook post. Lipstick too bright, smile too wide, eyes scanning me like she didn't quite believe I was real. "You came," she said, like I was some ghost from a campfire story. Inside, everything smelled like pot roast and old wallpaper. My mom was in the kitchen, clanging pans like she was punishing them. And my dad was already 3 beers in, settled into his recliner like a man who hadn't moved since I left. The dining table was set for 8. Rachel's kids were on tablets, ignoring each other, and Brent gave me a handshake like we were doing a job interview. Dinner started awkward, which was about what I expected. Questions that weren't really questions. "So what are you doing these days?" Followed by immediate topic changes when I gave vague answers. Rachel filled the silence with talk about school drop-offs and Little League, and my mom kept nodding like she was hearing the gospel. No one mentioned my 10-year absence. Not a damn word. Like it was just a quirky detail, like I'd only missed a few birthdays, not an entire decade of being alive. And then, just as I was reaching for the mashed potatoes, my mother, in her infinite tact and timing, looked me dead in the eye and asked, "When are you going to make us proud like your sister did?" The whole table froze. Even the kids looked up. Rachel's fork paused midair. My dad scratched his neck, avoiding my face. It was the same tone she used when I was 14 and got a C in algebra. Disappointed but still smug, like she was offering me a chance to do better, to be better, if only I'd try harder. I didn't say anything. Not right away. I just smiled, then reached slowly into my purse. Because sometimes silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. And they were about to learn that the quiet one had more to say than they ever expected. When I stepped into that dining room, I expected nothing. No warmth, no reconnection, no teary-eyed reunion montage, like the ones they pipe out in cheap network dramas, just awkward chairs, clinking forks, and a long table where I'd always been a stranger, even when I lived under that very roof. The table itself hadn't changed. It was still the same oak monstrosity my dad refinished in the garage during a 2-month stint of unemployment, still had the scratch from when Rachel dropped the carving knife at Thanksgiving senior year, still groaned under the weight of dishes no one really wanted to eat, but everyone pretended to love out of habit and obligation. My mother was wearing that apron, the one with the faded "Bless This Mess" embroidery she'd gotten from some church retreat in the early 90s, and her hair was done the exact same way it always was, like a monument to stiffness and structure, tightly curled and overly sprayed until it didn't move even when she turned too fast. She had gold, of course, lines sharper than before, jaw tighter, but that air of judgment hadn't dulled one bit. If anything, it had hardened, calcified into something colder, more precise, as if years of disappointment had become her favorite seasoning. My father didn't bother to stand when I entered. He just gave a small grunt and a nod that could have meant anything. "Hello, sit down, don't cause trouble," and reached for his can of Coors like it was an extension of his own hand. Brent, Rachel's husband, had the strained politeness of a man who knew better than to wade into family waters deeper than his understanding. And Rachel, well, Rachel looked like she was trying to hold it all together, trying to be the glue, the diplomat, the smiling peacekeeper who pretends there's no war happening even as the ceiling caves in. Dinner began the way these things always do. Too many hands passing dishes, too many forced compliments about the roast, too many overeager jokes from Brent that died before reaching the end of the table. The kids, bless them, didn't even pretend to engage. They tapped quietly at their tablets, eyes glazed, heads bowed like little monks worshipping at the altar of distraction. I envied them for a second, their ability to be physically present but emotionally elsewhere, to retreat without judgment. No one asked me anything of substance. Rachel tried, bless her, with small stabs of conversation. "Where are you living now? Do you like your job? How's the weather in D.C.?" But her questions were soft, padded. The kind of things you ask an old coworker in a parking lot, not your own sister who'd been off-grid for a decade. And I gave her nothing more than what she offered me. Vague answers, careful tones, sentences with no edges. Just enough truth to seem sincere, but not enough to invite curiosity. I could feel the pressure building, not from them, not exactly. They were too wrapped up in their own rituals to notice. But inside me, somewhere between my ribs and my spine, a slow tightening, a coiling of things long ignored. 10 years of silence had not erased the memories. If anything, it had sharpened them. I remembered every holiday skipped, every card not sent, every voicemail left unanswered not out of cruelty, but preservation. I remembered Rachel's last message years ago. Something about Mom being sick, or at least claiming to be, and how she signed off with, "It would mean a lot if you called." I never did. I told myself it was better that way. And then came the moment. It was so casual, so practiced, so sickeningly familiar that it might as well have been scripted. My mother, after refilling her wine glass with a tight-lipped smile and a clink that sounded too sharp for crystal, turned to me with the kind of expression reserved for awkward churchgoers and disappointing relatives, tilted her head like she was examining a poorly wrapped gift, and said, "You know, Emily, when are you going to make us proud like your sister did?" There it was, the line, that same old refrain, spoken like gospel, like law, like gravity. Rachel's fork froze midair. Even the kids looked up from their screens, sensing something in the air that didn't quite match the usual rhythm of roast beef and mashed potatoes. My father shifted in his seat, eyes flicking toward my mother like maybe, just maybe, she had crossed a line, though he didn't say a word. Brent cleared his throat, then buried it in his beer. My mother's face didn't twitch, not once. That was her talent, dropping bombs with the smile of a church lady, using politeness like a knife. Her voice wasn't angry. It was soft, sweet, like she was offering me a second chance to fix whatever invisible mistake I'd made by being who I was. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I reached for my wine, took a long sip, and let the silence stretch, because silence has a weight most people can't carry. And when I looked at her, really looked at her, I saw something that hadn't been there before. Not cruelty exactly, not even malice, just certainty, the unwavering belief that Rachel's way was the right way, and that anything outside of that was failure disguised as freedom. And that was the moment I decided. Not to fight, not to shout, not to defend, but to show them. Because people like them, people who live in neat boxes with clear rules and safe praise, they don't hear words, they don't understand struggle, but they do understand images, proof, something undeniable that interrupts their script. So I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and scrolled to the photo. I didn't say a word. I just turned the screen toward her and waited. But I'll tell you about that in a moment, because sometimes the reaction is more important than the reveal. And when she saw it, when they all saw it, the room didn't just fall silent, it stopped. Like time itself forgot to keep moving. When I turned that phone screen toward my mother, I didn't expect a gasp or a dramatic monologue, and I wasn't angling for validation, not after so many years of being the blurred figure in the family photo, the name mentioned with a shrug or, more often, not mentioned at all. I expected confusion, maybe denial, possibly a joke about Photoshop, or how I must have stumbled into a press event by accident. What I got, though, was something far better, stillness, heavy and immediate, the kind of silence that fills a room like smoke after a fire has been set, the kind that settles in your throat and makes breathing suddenly seem like a conscious decision. The photo wasn't grainy, it wasn't blurry, it was sharp, clear, and taken with a camera that most civilians never get within 10 feet of. I was wearing tactical gear, no lipstick, no smile, no attempt to soften my presence. Standing straight-backed next to the President of the United States, inside what was clearly a secure operations center, flanked by 3 other individuals whose identities had been deliberately obscured. But my face, my very real, very undeniable face, was front and center, unreadable, calm, every inch of it soaked in professionalism and the gravity of whatever crisis we were managing that day. It was a photo no one outside of our circles should ever see, but exceptions get made when the right people give the right nods. My mother leaned forward, squinting, then jerked her head back like the image had burned her eyes. "What is this?" she asked, her voice brittle and low, cracking just enough to betray the unease rising under her skin. My father sat straighter in his chair, one hand still holding his beer can, mid-air like he'd forgotten he was drinking. Rachel, who had been halfway through a sip of water, slowly set her glass down, not blinking, her mouth slightly open as if her brain was still buffering, trying to reconcile the image in front of her with the sister she'd always kept tucked neatly in the category of mild disappointment. "That," I said, keeping my voice calm, measured, and almost bored, "was taken last Tuesday, 5 minutes before the White House went into a full lockdown, over an international threat that never made the news. It didn't make the news because we didn't let it. We handled it, quietly, effectively, like we always do." My words didn't spark immediate comprehension. There was too much distance between the life they assumed I led and the one I actually lived. They didn't know what it meant to be briefed in bunkers at 2 a.m, to memorize the layout of foreign consulates by heart, to carry encrypted phones that self-destructed after being compromised, or to stand in rooms where every conversation was one wrong word away from international collapse. These weren't things I could explain in the middle of dinner while the mashed potatoes cooled and the gravy congealed in its dish, so I didn't bother trying. My father was the first to speak. "That's real?" he asked. And though his voice was quiet, the way he asked it mattered. He wasn't challenging me, not this time. He was asking like someone who knew the answer but needed to hear it out loud, maybe because part of him was still clinging to the idea that the daughter he'd dismissed for so long couldn't possibly be standing beside the leader of the free world, not unless something about his entire worldview had been profoundly wrong for decades. I nodded. Very real and very classified, which is why you won't hear me say much more than that. Brent, ever the harmless spectator, let out a low whistle and mumbled, "Holy hell," but Rachel elbowed him into silence. Her eyes hadn't left my face since I'd spoken, and I could see the old patterns falling apart behind her stare, the years of careful assumptions, of superiority, masked as sisterly concern, all crumbling in real time. You never said anything," she whispered, like it was a betrayal, like the real crime was not letting her know I'd been doing something important all this time. "No one asked," I replied simply, folding my napkin, letting that small truth hang in the air like a verdict. Mom looked like she was trying to form words, but they wouldn't come. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her wine glass again. Not to drink, but to fidget, to ground herself in something familiar. The power dynamic at the table had shifted entirely, not with a bang, but with a single image, one photograph that shattered years of misconceptions, one glimpse into a life none of them had the imagination to envision. "Why would you keep something like that from your family?" she finally asked, voice hardening, retreating into blame the way people do when faced with a truth too large to hold. "We're your parents. We deserve to know." I looked at her, not angry, not smug, but with the clarity of someone who had long since stopped waiting for understanding and had learned to thrive without it. "You don't earn trust by accident, Mom. And you don't get access to someone's life just because you share DNA. Every time I tried to talk about the things I loved, you told me to be more like Rachel. So I stopped telling you anything." The weight of that sentence landed harder than the photo had. My father stared down at his plate, suddenly fascinated by green beans. Brent looked away, awkwardly examining the ceiling. Even the kids, oblivious moments ago, sensed the quiet shift in the room and paused their games to glance between the adults, perhaps unsure whether this was just another boring grown-up fight or something more. Rachel stood up and motioned for me to follow her. "Kitchen," she said under her breath. And I followed, not because I owed her anything, but because I was curious about what she could possibly say now that her image of me had collapsed into something too large and too complex to control. In the kitchen, she turned to face me, arms crossed, her voice lowered but urgent. "What the hell do you do, Emily? Seriously, are you some kind of spy? Secret Service? CIA?" I shrugged. "I work in national security. Sometimes that means operations. Sometimes that means coordination. Sometimes it means nothing I can put into a sentence." She laughed once, not because it was funny, but because it was the only way she could process what she was hearing. "I thought you were bartending in Denver. That's what Mom always said." "Well," I said, grabbing a grape off the fruit bowl and popping it into my mouth, "that's the thing about people who don't ask questions. They tend to make up answers." She didn't speak for a moment, just stared at me like she was trying to find the Emily she'd known beneath this new, sharper version. But I was still me, just finally visible. And while she tried to assemble her thoughts, I knew, deep in my gut, that something had cracked open, and there would be no going back. Not to the way things were, not to the fantasy, where I was just the sister who never quite made it. Because I had made it, just not in any way they could measure with report cards, wedding photos, or polite dinner table conversation. And the best part? I wasn't done yet. There's something strange about standing in the same kitchen where you once spilled Kool-Aid on your Sunday dress and got grounded for a week. Only now you're staring down a sister who's looking at you not with pity or superiority, but with something closer to fear wrapped in awe, as if the version of you she knew has been quietly erased and replaced by a stranger who speaks a different language, one that doesn't need approval, doesn't ask for space, and doesn't shrink under the weight of family memory. It's surreal in the way that only deeply personal moments can be, not because of what's said, but because of what remains unspoken, trapped between the lines of lives that grew apart under the same roof. Rachel stood there, arms folded but not in anger, more like a barrier she was building to protect herself from Boo, realizing that everything she believed about her place in the family might have been shaped around a convenient lie. She didn't know how to look at me anymore, not as the older sister who never called, not as the one who skipped every christening and birthday party, but as a person who had carried something enormous and invisible for over a decade. A weight not measured in miles or medals, but in silence and decisions made without the luxury of validation. "I just don't understand," she said quietly, eyes flickering toward the doorway as if afraid our parents would overhear, even though she was the one who dragged me in here. "Why you wouldn't just tell us? If it was something important, something real." And there it was again, that phrase, that ever-present framework of assumption. If it was something real, as if reality were only shaped by what they could see, touch, or brag about on Facebook. As if my life only counted once it could be framed in a photo or summarized in a Christmas letter. I took a breath, not out of exasperation, but out of habit, because explaining this part of my life never came easy, and not because it was difficult to describe, but because people like Rachel, people who'd never seen beyond the horizon of predictability, could never truly understand what it meant to be trusted with things that don't get shared at family dinners. "Because that's the job," I said, not harshly, but with the clarity of someone who had said these words before, though never to someone who'd needed to hear them this badly. "You don't brag about it, you don't post about it, and you don't drop it into casual conversation over potato salad. You do the work, and if you're lucky, no one ever has to know what you prevented." She blinked at that, a small crease forming between her brows, the one she always got when trying to make sense of something that didn't fit into her tidy worldview. "But doesn't it ever feel lonely?" The question was more honest than I expected, and it caught me slightly off guard, not because I hadn't asked it of myself before, but because it was the first time Rachel had spoken to me like a person, not a disappointment or a curiosity. I looked at her, and for a moment, I didn't see the sister who won the spelling bees and got all the praise. I saw a woman holding her perfect little life together with glue sticks and calendar reminders. A woman who smiled at PTA meetings and cried in the laundry room. A woman who might be quietly terrified that she chose safety over meaning, and now wasn't sure it had been worth it. "It used to," I admitted, the words softer than I intended, shaped more by memory than by performance. But over time, you stop needing people to clap for you when you know what you did mattered. You learn that recognition isn't currency in that world, it's liability. And honestly, most days I'm fine with that. She nodded slowly, then leaned against the kitchen counter like her knees were suddenly unsure. "Is that why you left?" she asked, voice low. "All those years ago, did you leave because of us?" I didn't want to lie. I didn't want to soften it, because sugarcoating the past would only dilute the moment. And if I was going to let her see even a corner of the truth, I had to let her see all of it. So I said what needed to be said, the words steady but heavy like stones dropped in deep water. I left because I couldn't breathe in that house anymore. I left because every time I tried to talk about what I cared about, it was met with a joke, a shrug, or a reminder that Rachel did it better. I left because I was drowning in being invisible, and I figured if I had to disappear, I might as well do it on my own terms. She didn't cry, but something flickered across her face. Something small and private, like shame or recognition. And I didn't press it because we weren't the kind of sisters who hugged it out or traded confessions over ice cream. We were the kind of sisters who lived in different weather systems, occasionally passing each other like cold fronts, always with a forecast of tension and unresolved stories. From the dining room, I heard my mother laughing, too loud, too high, probably trying to diffuse the silence left in my absence, probably telling some story about Rachel's last dental conference or the church bake sale, or whatever safe little topic made her feel like the world still made sense. It struck me then how little she really wanted to know me, how much effort she had spent over the years maintaining a fiction of motherhood that didn't include asking real questions. She didn't want the truth. She wanted the version of me that was easy to dismiss, the sister to the star, the ghost in the attic. Rachel glanced toward the sound, then back at me. "You think they'll ever get it?" I shook my head. "No, but I'm not here for them." She paused, processing that. And when she finally spoke, her voice was softer, like it belonged to someone who wasn't quite sure who she was anymore. "Then why did you come?" It was a fair question, and I'd asked myself the same one at least a dozen times since stepping off the plane. But the answer came easily now, clearer than it had been even the night I booked the ticket. Because I needed to see it for myself, that I didn't need this table, this family, or their approval to be whole. And maybe, just maybe, to remind them that the daughter they buried in silence is still very much alive. Rachel opened her mouth to say something, but just then, from the corner of the counter, my phone buzzed. A single message, no name. Just a secure line with a 3-word directive. "Standby, Argentina confirmed." I read it once, locked the screen, and slid the phone back into my pocket. Rachel saw the change in my face, that flicker of recalibration I couldn't quite hide, and her eyes widened just enough to know she understood something was about to shift again. "You have to go?" I didn't nod. I didn't say yes. I just stepped back toward the dining room, toward the table where the rest of the family was still stuck in the same loop they'd always been in. But this time, I was the one holding the remote, and I was ready to change the channel. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when everyone knows the center of gravity has shifted, when the roles people clung to like lifeboats in a storm are no longer buoyant, when the unspoken agreements that kept a family functioning, however dysfunctionally, start to fracture under the weight of something undeniable. That was the silence I walked back into as I returned to the dining room, leaving Rachel behind in the kitchen, still staring at the place where I'd stood, like she could hold on to the echo of what I had just said if she stood still long enough. My mother was in the middle of telling some long-winded anecdote about how Rachel had managed to coordinate a fundraising raffle for the local school, an event, no doubt, that involved custom-labeled water bottles and perfectly portioned snack bags in eco-friendly containers. And her voice trailed off mid-sentence when she noticed me step back into the room, the smile on her face freezing in place, as if she were trying to decide whether to plaster over the awkwardness or let it hang like smoke in a closed room. My father shifted again in his seat, his beer now forgotten on the edge of a napkin-stained coaster, while Brent looked between us all like a man who had wandered into the final scene of a movie he hadn't seen the beginning of and wasn't sure he wanted to stay for the credits. I didn't sit down right away. I stood at the head of the table, the only spot still open, and I looked at each of them. Not quickly, not casually, but fully and directly, the way you do when you've spent most of your life avoiding eye contact with people who never really saw you. And now that you're finally visible, you want to make sure they know it's not an accident. I could feel the words rising in my chest. Not a speech, not a monologue rehearsed in hotel mirrors or long car rides, but something raw and settled, something that had been waiting for exactly this moment to be said. Not for approval, not for vindication, but for the simple, undeniable fact that I had earned the right to speak and be heard, even if they didn't understand the language. I used to think, I began slowly, deliberately, with the weight of 1,000 swallowed truths behind every syllable, that the worst thing in the world was being hated by your own family. That being the disappointment, the one who didn't fit, the one who got left out of photo albums and holiday traditions, was the deepest kind of wound a person could carry. But over time, I realized something else entirely. Being invisible, being ignored while standing in plain sight, is so much worse. Because when you're hated, at least you matter enough to be felt. They didn't move, no one interrupted, not even my mother, whose hands had stilled mid-folding of a napkin, like she was unsure whether to defend herself or just ride the wave of what was coming. I spent 10 years building something you can't put in a scrapbook, I continued, my eyes landing on her for a fraction longer than the others, just enough to make sure she understood the point wasn't to attack, but to correct. I've sat in rooms where the wrong decision would cost hundreds of lives. I've escorted diplomats out of bomb threats. I've coordinated extractions in countries you couldn't pronounce. And I've read intelligence reports that kept entire regions from falling into chaos. And I did it all without ever expecting to be clapped for around a dinner table. I finally pulled out the chair, but I didn't sit. Instead, I placed my phone on the table, screen down, and looked across at Rachel's kids, who were watching me now, not with the indifference they had earlier, but with the wide-eyed curiosity of children who have just realized they've been sitting across from someone whose story doesn't fit neatly into their coloring books. I didn't come back here because I needed anything from you, I said, now softer, but no less firm. Not forgiveness, not apology, not some late-stage acknowledgement that maybe I wasn't a total screw-up. I came back to look you all in the eyes and prove, once and for all, that the daughter you dismissed, the one you pitied, the one you talked about in past tense as if she'd failed to live up to your expectations, is more than you ever made space for. My father opened his mouth, maybe to speak, maybe to offer some deflated line about how he never meant to push me away, but I stopped him with a small shake of my head. Not cruel, just final. Because some things didn't need to be repaired. They just needed to be acknowledged and left behind. Then my phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't need to check it. I knew what it meant. When your life is built around timing, around coded phrases and quiet exits, you learn to read the vibrations of urgency like a second language. The message was a confirmation, another op greenlit, another flight I'd need to be on in the next 12 hours, another country where I'd blend into the crowd until it was time not to. I looked up, and Rachel was standing just beyond the doorway, watching silently. Her expression had shifted from confusion to something closer to understanding, or maybe just resignation, the kind that comes when a story you've believed your whole life suddenly unravels and you're left holding threads that don't lead where you thought they would. "You're leaving again, aren't you?" she asked, not accusatory, just aware. "Yes," I said with no apology in my tone, no softness to dull the truth. "I go where I'm needed." She stepped forward, paused, then asked something I hadn't expected, something so simple and devastating I almost missed the weight behind it. "Will we ever really know you?" I could have given her the easy answer, the nice one, the maybe or someday, that families love to wrap themselves in like security blankets. But I didn't, because the truth was far less romantic and far more real. "No," I said, steady and clear. "But that's not the point. The point is you had the chance." Rachel didn't reply, just nodded once, and in that small gesture, I saw every missed opportunity between us, every moment she might have asked the harder questions, every time she chose comfort over connection, and every time I let her. It wasn't cruel that moment. It was necessary. It was two people standing on opposite shores of a river that neither of them had the tools to cross, not because they didn't want to, but because they'd waited too long to build the bridge. I picked up my phone, slipped it into my coat pocket, and turned toward the front door. My mother didn't say goodbye. My father didn't ask me to stay. Brent gave a small nod, and the kids waved, not because they were told to, but because something about me had changed in their eyes, and even children can feel when the air in a room shifts. Rachel followed me to the porch, the screen door creaking shut behind her, and for a moment, we stood there in the quiet dusk, the air heavy with everything we didn't say. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why show them this now after all this time?" I paused on the last step, turned slightly, and gave her the only answer that felt honest. Because I finally didn't care if they believed me. And then I walked down the path, past the hedges I used to trim every summer under Dad's barking orders, past the mailbox that still bore our last name in faded gold letters, and toward the rented car that waited like a clean break from everything that had just happened. I didn't look back. Not because I was angry, but because some things, once left, aren't meant to be returned to, not the way they were. As I pulled away, the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror, until it became just another place on the map, another chapter closed, not with a bang, not with forgiveness, but with clarity. And sometimes that's more than enough.